Hello, I'm Alastair Lynn, and I'm here at Cambridge University Press Bookshop to welcome you to this webinar to mark and reflect on the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a little bit odd here, I have to say, to be at an event where I'm the only person present in the bookshop. There's no excitable chatter with a pre-talk, which I miss, frankly. I have to believe you're all out there sitting silently behind your screens and just anticipating the great conversation that I'm sure is about to begin. The great thing, obviously, about this kind of event is that we're able to invite you wherever you are in the world, and importantly, gather together these four brilliant academics who've kindly agreed to talk to us tonight. Because obviously they're not all in the UK, wouldn't be able to get them in the bookshop. Our budget just doesn't stretch that far, I'm afraid. But anyway, my colleague Rachel will do the introduction shortly, but I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I didn't remind you that all four speakers are very kindly giving their time for free tonight. And I think the best way we can thank them is to buy copies of their books. I'm sure many of you know them already, but in a moment I will post a link in the chat where you can buy the books at 30% discount. There are also articles and chapters that you can access for free. But yeah, really I encourage you to show your support of these brilliant academics and buy a book at the end. That would be great. Thank you ever so much. In the meantime, though, thank you all once again for coming. I hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. And without further ado, I'll pass over to my colleague Rachel to get things started.
Thank you, Alastair. I'm really pleased to be a part of today's panel marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And many thanks to the Cambridge University Press Bookshop for hosting today's virtual event. My name is Rachel Blaifeder, and I'm the interim editor of History and Asian Studies at Cambridge University Press. Joining us today are the authors of three recently published press books: The Chinese Communist Party, A Century and 10 Lives, June 4th, The Tiananmen Protests and Beijing Massacre of 1989, and Rethinking Chinese Politics. I would now like to introduce today's panelists. We will begin with a discussion of the Chinese Communist Party, a collection of essays detailing the lives of 10 people, one for each decade of the party's existence, who led or engaged with the CCP. Representing the book are Hans van de Ven, Professor of Modern Chinese History at the University of Cambridge, and Julia Lovell, Professor of Modern Chinese History and Literature at the University of London, Birkbeck. Our panel will continue with author Joseph Fewsmith, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at Boston University. Professor Fewsmith will be discussing his latest book, Rethinking Chinese Politics, which offers a comprehensive but accessible examination of how elite politics work during the period from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping. Before turning to our Q&A, our discussion concludes with Jeremy Brown, Associate Professor of Modern Chinese History at Simon Fraser University. Professor Brown will be discussing his new book, June 4th, which provides a vivid new social history of the Tiananmen protests, Beijing Massacre, and nationwide crackdown of 1989. I'll now turn things over to Hans and Julia.
Thanks so much, Rachel, for that introduction. It's really wonderful to be speaking to such eminent authors and to be speaking about these wonderful new books. Hans, do you want to start maybe talking a little bit about how the book that you edited and that I contributed to came into being? I might start with a very general question, which is, why did you want to do this book in particular?
I just wanted to thank everybody, first of all, for joining this panel. And I think we're going to have a very interesting discussion about many things. But to answer Julia's question, when my co-editors, Klaus Mühlhahn from Germany and Tim Cheek from UBC, started thinking about this, we thought, well, very likely at the centenary, you're going to have two main narratives, one of the party as this great evil thing, and then one highly romanticized, heroic version of the party in Beijing. and we wanted to do something that would challenge both main narratives that we anticipated to come out. And would be a very good way of doing that would be not to focus on the main, as party history has always been done in China as well as outside China, the main congresses, the conferences, the resolutions, sort of all the textual stuff, but actually make it a very individual story. So to select one person for one decade about some sort of incident. And the advantage we thought of too of doing it that way was that we could make the party come alive by telling an individual story. Because, you know, people who don't know China, don't know the party, it's a very confusing mess, the whole thing. People don't even know where Shenzhen or Shanghai might be on the map, and then we're introducing all these stuff. So to hang it around one individual made sense. In doing this, actually, it's been great fun, very interesting. And I think a couple of themes that emerged as we were going through the exercise. We learned actually a great deal ourselves. And two things we wanted to bring out most clearly was that we see the party as having actually great difficulty in defining itself. And I think it made up of very different sorts of traditions. You have, of course, the military authoritarian tradition that is now dominant, but you also have had a very liberal, even a liberal communist tradition. And you have had a very international tradition, without which, in fact, the party would never have been born or sustained itself for so long. And of course, I must say that in the founding of the Chinese Communist Party, my countryman, Hank Snevely, has played a significant role, which is not something Xi Jinping chose to highlight when he spoke a couple of days ago, So that the other thing that came out to us was that you can sort of see 3 or 4 periods, beginning as a party of intellectuals who were very European-derived Marxism-Leninism. And then you get that's transformed in China into a Maoist rural revolution type thing that takes over and that actually spreads around the world. There's many imitators around the world. And then you move into sort of this early PRC period. And then what we see now sort of as a counter-reformation under Xi Jinping. And these seems, sort of just by telling those stories, these themes came to stand out. But I want to ask you a question, Julia. You'll have noticed in the book, there's no decade that we identified as specifically dedicated to Mao. Mao appears in your chapter, your wonderful, brilliant chapter, as a very dead Mao, physically dead, but alive around the world in different sorts of ways. And I was reading the TLS somewhere some time ago, and somewhere somebody smart made the observation that, 500 years from now, when historians think back to the 20th century, they might, who would they think about? And his answer was very likely Buzz Aldrin, Neil Armstrong, because they were the first persons to land on the moon, and Mao. And that sort of raises to me the question, will we ever be able to get Mao out of our minds? Will we be able to think about the 20th century without Mao? You have dealt with Mao. Mao has been in your thinking for a long time. So what's your thinking about that?
What an interesting question. I think probably 2 ways of answering that. One is to consider the situation within China, and one is to consider the situation outside China. And perhaps you, Joe and Jeremy, would disagree, but I can't imagine a China without Mao unless the CCP stands down in some way. The Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, made a very clear strategic decision at the end of the 1970s that they weren't going to de-Maoify in the way that the Soviet Union de-Stalinized after the death of Mao with Khrushchev's secret speech in 1956. And there was a sort of clear pragmatic thinking behind that. Deng Xiaoping, Mao's not quite immediate successor, but successor within 2 or 3 years, decreed that if the party threw out Mao, it would just damage historical legitimacy too much. And, maths was on the side of the Soviets in the way that it wasn't on the side of the CCP, i.e. the Soviets could throw out Stalin, but they still had Lenin. They had two party founders, whereas in terms of a successful ruling party, the CCP, you really only have Mao as a founder. Mao was never purged from the CCP, and it's really impossible to imagine a world in which he would be, obviously physically, and on the most sort of simple sense, he's very central to China, with his portrait hanging in Tiananmen Square and his embalmed body in the middle of Tiananmen Square. And I think the volume has really been turned up on the Maoist political culture after Xi's accession to power at the end of 2012. I'm not saying that China today is exactly like the China of Mao. How could it be? China is transformed beyond recognition. But Xi has revived parts of the Maoist political repertoire, some of those slogans, and above all, of course, the leadership, the cult of leadership, this time centered around Xi and not Mao. Thinking about Mao outside China, I think it's incredibly interesting the way that he has become kitschified, and troubling also the way that he has become kitschified, the way that he has merged into popular culture in a way that I don't think has an analogue with other authoritarian, totalitarian dictators in any other parts of the world. Obviously, the standout act of kitschification, sort of pop artification, is Andy Warhol's Mao. To think of something comparable for Hitler or Stalin is completely unthinkable, which is curious if you think, but particularly after Yung Chang and John Halliday's biography of 2005, 2006, I think in popular impressions, people do equate Mao, the enormities of Mao, with those of Hitler and Stalin, and yet his position in political culture is so different. Tourists go to China and snap up copies of the Little Red Book, or buy lighters which play the Maoist anthem, "The East is Red," and with pictures of Mao on. So I think this tells us something sort of very curious about Mao. I think maybe more broadly it tells us something about Western attitudes to China, how a sort of greater sense of detachment about China, which of course has existed since the early modern period, a sort of sense, a tendency either to romanticize or demonize China. So I find it very curious, but also troubling.
Right, that's great. I'm sure there are many themes we can pick up later in the chat, but I suspect we should yield to. I think Joe was going to go next, right? So, Joe.
Well, thank you very much, Hans. I very much enjoyed your discussion, and it reminds me of course, the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi. Everybody for 2,000 years cursed him, but he still had an enormous impact on Chinese history. And I'm afraid that Mao may be very much in that genre, that he's the pig and the python, that he's just there, and China's going to have to work around him in some way, which kind of gets me into my own topic, because I've had a very long-standing interest in elite politics, which this book picks up on, and I've been very interested in what has been said about the so-called institutionalization of leadership. And as much as many of the practices of the Chinese Communist Party seem to be institutionalized, if you look closely at elite politics, and by elite politics, I mean that group of people that China calls a party and state leadership, which includes the Politburo Standing Committee, Central Military Commission, those folks. One of the things that really strikes you is that despite what I think were Deng Xiaoping's genuine efforts to institutionalize the system, it hasn't happened. Political power really cannot be passed along in an institutionalized way in China. You can hopefully set somebody up for it, But ultimately, that person has to grasp power. And by grasping power, what you really do mean is promoting your friends, your allies, limiting the access to power of other people. And, I think the primary example of that, before we get to Xi Jinping, of course, is that Deng Xiaoping ultimately threw his weight behind Jiang Zemin. Then, of course, the first thing he had to do to allow Jiang Zemin to actually take power, to live up to the name that Deng gave him, the core of the leadership, was to purge the military. If Deng had not purged the military of people he had known for 60 years, then Jiang Zemin never could have solidified his support in the party or in the military, so much so that he looms over Hu Jintao, and Hu Jintao's never really able to grasp the brass ring, really hold on to the reins of power. And of course, by the time you get to the Hu Jintao, the end of the Hu Jintao period, the party is beset by all sorts of problems: deep corruption, deep factionalism, the fear of a very real fear, I think, of so-called peaceful evolution, that the CCP might go the way of the Communist Party in the Soviet Union. And whether that was a real fear or a trumped up fear, Xi Jinping has been able to play on all those things to get rid of many of the balances that had dominated in Chinese politics prior to that, and really solidified his own leadership to the point that the recently passed regulations governing the Central Committee say that the Central Committee, and indeed all members of the Communist Party, must uphold the leadership position, the core leadership position of Xi Jinping. I don't know if documents can personalize things, because documents are supposed to be things that guide institutions, but it really does personalize leadership. And in that regard, you see that Xi Jinping is really reversing almost everything that Deng Xiaoping did. You use the word counter-reformation. I think that that's exactly the word that should be used here. I don't think it's in my book. I'll second edition quickly, Rachel. In any case, if Deng Xiaoping was looking at the Maoist period, and remember, Mao was his political mentor, he saw Mao as just overwhelming the system, the personalization of power, the centralization of power. It didn't allow the system to function. And so he began to decentralize power and economics in particular, in a particular way. He certainly tried to play down his own leadership function, as opposed to Mao's personality cult, all these sorts of things, systemizing things like promotions, right? Didn't like helicopter promotions that are so prominent in the Cultural Revolution. What is she doing? He's centralizing power, both as a system and as a person. He's, certainly has brought back the cult of the leadership. He's not the self-effacing leader that Deng Xiaoping was. He has certainly brought back helicopter promotions. You now have two members of the Politburo Standing Committee that had never served on the Central Committee prior to this last party Congress. It's really quite extraordinary. And one other thing that Deng Xiaoping did was to make it so that the party leader could not pick his own successor. At one point, Deng Xiaoping told Oriana Fallaci, the Italian journalist, that to pick your own successor was futile. And that thought stuck with him So at the same time that he promoted Jiang Zemin, he said, by the way, Hu Jintao is going to take over in 10 years. That was something that Deng Xiaoping decreed in 1992, 10 years before Hu Jintao took over. So rather than being the peaceful institutionalized succession of leadership that many of us thought it was, that was really a, well, if you will, a feudal decision decreed by Deng Xiaoping. And so, and then of course, the promotion of Hu Jintao meant that of Xi Jinping meant that Hu Jintao could not pick his own successor. But you better believe that Xi Jinping is going to pick his own successor. So we're back to feudal rule. I think on that note, I will pass the baton to Jeremy.
Thank you, Joe, and thanks so much to Cambridge University Press for publishing my book, for organizing this event. I want to thank Diane Benson and Neil Benson for letting me use their house and their internet connection so I can join you today. And I should also acknowledge respectfully that I'm an uninvited guest on the ancestral traditional territory of the Takelma and Shasta peoples here in Southern Oregon, where I am today. And I have some conflicted feelings about marking the 100th anniversary of the founding of the Chinese Communist Party. And that's because I don't do party history. I sort of position myself as being more interested in history, modern Chinese history, that's outside of party history, or that's even opposed to party history. But we need party history. And so I'm also grateful to be here today, to be included in this event, because key turning points in modern Chinese history, like June 4th, 1989, are a central part of Chinese history under Communist Party rule. And so I think it's crucial for sensitive topics like June 4th, like the Beijing Massacre of 1989, to be part of the story when we look back on 100 years of party history. Because without studying Communist Party leaders' willingness to use the army to shoot and kill hundreds of unarmed civilians in Beijing in 1989, it's impossible to understand how the Communist Party has lasted and existed for 100 years. And it's impossible to understand why it looks like it does and operates like it does in 2021. So my book treats June 4th as a three-stage event. And stage one was a nationwide protest movement between April 15th and June 3rd of 1989 that was opposing corruption, calling for transparency, advocating for freedom of speech, calling for independent student organizations, autonomous worker unions, and calling for dialogue between people and the government. And so millions of Beijing citizens, and many of them were party members themselves, marched on the streets of Beijing in support of hunger striking students. And there were also protests in every province and every autonomous region in China in the spring of 1989. And people joined these protests for all kinds of reasons. Some people had their hopes raised by the increasing freedoms and economic opportunities of the 1980s. And these were genuine efforts by two general secretaries of the Communist Party, Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang, to reform the party's governance. So people had their hopes raised by the efforts of those two men, those two leaders. And other people were angry, they were traumatized, they had grievances. Some of them were sparked by the violence of the one-child policy, which was really the most momentous thing the party did in the 1980s in terms of the number of people whose lives it drastically changed. So I want to make sure I mention that today as well. And so you have this combination of high hopes and grievances that pushed people to hit the streets to organize and demand change in spring of 1989. Stage two of June 4th is the sad part, the tragic part. It was the Beijing Massacre of June 3rd, 4th, 5th, and 6th of 1989. And so the massacre actually starts on the evening of June 3rd. It escalates on June 4th in the early hours of June 4th, and the army is still shooting and killing unarmed civilians on June 5th and 6th. And so here in this part of the book, I draw on the research of the Tiananmen mothers. These are parents whose children went out and never came home on June 3rd. And so I'm trying to write a victim-centered account of the massacre. I'm looking for patterns in who died, where they died, what they were doing when they died. China's top leader at the time was Deng Xiaoping. Joe's talked about him quite a bit. Deng was not the general secretary of the Communist Party in 1989. He was in charge of the military. He had more power than anybody else in the party because of his seniority and because of his revolutionary prestige. And so Deng was the one who called for the mobilization of more than 180,000 troops from the People's Liberation Army to impose martial law in most urban districts of Beijing. And on the evening of June 3rd, soldiers with assault rifles and driving tanks invaded China's capital city. The 38th Group Army shot indiscriminately at crowds and at buildings as it moved toward Tiananmen Square from the west side of Beijing. It had permission to use deadly force to clear Tiananmen Square before dawn the next morning. And the 15th Airborne did the same thing as it moved toward the square from the south. And we don't know how many people died. At a minimum, it was more than 700. At a maximum, it was maybe a bit higher than 2,600. And most people who died during the massacre died in the streets outside of the square, on that approach to the square rather than in the square itself. Some were students, but many more victims were civilians who wanted to protect the students in the square. They went out because they were curious. They wanted to witness history. They heard loud noises. They wanted to check it out. And other victims were people who were commuting to work. They were trying to buy medicine for their sick children, or they were even hiding inside their homes when stray bullets hit them and killed them. And so they had no intention of encountering the army at all. But that was the army that killed them. And so my research confirms that bloodshed was not necessary. It was not inevitable. There were many possible paths to a peaceful resolution of the protests in 1989. Stage 3 of this event that I call June 4th was the aftermath of the massacre. And this stage actually is continuing all the way to the present day. And by that, I mean that the people who opposed the massacre and the people who asked for alternatives to authoritarian single-party rule were punished, and they continue to be punished today. I'll tell you a story about one person in this group, a man named Chuan Ping. He was a 28-year-old factory worker in the city of Chongqing in 1989, and he was active in the city's protest movement in the spring of 1989. And when he learned of the Beijing massacre, the day after, June 5th, 1989, Chuan Ping was so outraged that he decided to set up a new political party. So he established his own political party called the China Action Party. And in July of 1989, the police arrested him for the crime of forming this new political party. And he served 8 years in prison. 3 of his associates who also joined this new party served time. And Chuan Ping ended up spending an additional 9 years in prison in the 2000s for his involvement in setting up another political party called the Chinese Democratic Party. So that's the Chinese Communist Party that's celebrating its 100th anniversary this month. Part of how it has lived to see 100 years is by imprisoning people who propose alternatives to authoritarian single-party rule. In 1989, Deng Xiaoping broke party rules to overcome resistance and to overrule objections from many other top Communist Party officials and military officials who wanted a peaceful resolution to the protests. And so I want to end on that note by mentioning the thousands and thousands of Communist Party members who themselves protested in 1989 and demanded not the overthrow of the party, but a reformed party, a better party that would protect freedom of speech, that would increase transparency, that would curb corruption. So if protesters' demands in 1989 had not been silenced by bullets and tanks, the Communist Party could have been much healthier on its 100th birthday. And so I'll end with that note. Thanks.
Thank you so much to all of our panelists. I'm amazed that we're only halfway in, so we have a healthy amount of time for Q&A. I want to encourage anyone that has not yet submitted a question to feel free to use the Q&A function. Please submit your questions. We'd love to hear them. We'd love to answer them. We are getting a couple in, but I just want to give a chance at the beginning, since we do have some extra time, to give our panelists to respond to each other, to any feedback, on what has already been discussed, what's been presented about your books, anything you'd like to share or came to mind as your fellow panelists were speaking, because it's really great to have you all in this virtual Zoom room with one another. So to have that chance to speak with one another to start things off would be great.
Okay, can I jump in first? I've one specific question to Joe and then a general one. For Joe, I mean, the issue of succession is key in so many political systems. Xi Jinping's changing of the rules opens up all kinds of issues. Some of the obvious ones, I heard a Chinese colleague of mine, a very sensible person, say that actually what Xi Jinping is trying to do is to change the succession system to avoid the problems of the past, and that he wants a much more regular version. I don't know whether that's, it was not just nonsense. It was something that was meant seriously to be taken seriously. So I want to have you, if you could speculate on how the problem that Xi Jinping has created by abolishing term limits, how that might play out. So my general question to everybody really is, what has stood out, what has been surprising in the commemorations that took place?
Well, to respond to your question, I find it difficult to read Xi Jinping's thoughts. What he thinks he's doing and what he is actually doing can turn out to be two different things. I think, by the way, that was very true of Deng Xiaoping, who said, I really want to institutionalize this system, but I want to keep it as a Leninist system. And you can't do both. Buklagenda, as Mencius would have reminded us, you can't have them both, right? And that may be the case of Xi Jinping. I'm assuming at this point that Xi Jinping will stay there for at least a third term and quite possibly a fourth or whatever. And that means that the successor to him eventually, assuming there is one, may not even be on the Central Committee today. You may be talking about somebody very significantly younger. In his consolidation of power, he's also pretty much eliminated what we used to call the Shanghai Gang, stiffly downgraded the, obviously many people in the military, as he's reformed the military, the Communist Youth League. In other words, there are a lot of people in that system who do not like Xi Jinping. Now, they may or may not be relevant, but I can imagine that without clear rules of succession, holding on for a long time, with resentments building up, I think that the succession, if and when it comes, could be really messy, including possible violence. So it may very well be that Xi Jinping, for whatever reason, is doing things that will hurt the party in very grievous ways. And, then when that happens, we will be comparing that outcome to what we think might have been the outcome had some of these party reformers in 1989 triumphed. It is a reasonable question to ask. We don't know the answer. I'm very worried about China's future. I should say China's future, not the future of the Chinese Communist Party. That's a different thing. If I could just make one other comment. I think the tone of the conversation today has been on a lot of the negative aspects of the Chinese system, and they are certainly there, as Jeremy in particular reminded us. On the other hand, all the public opinion surveys that we have suggests that an overwhelming number of people in China trust the party. And so we need to deal with this contradiction. Undoubtedly, large part of that is because the economy is continuing to hum along. For the most part, if you stay within these regulations, the party doesn't bother you. But as we've been reminded over and over again, as soon as you step outside the white lines, there's somebody there to remind you to get back in your lane. And so there's a deep contradiction there.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, and it was brought up in a review of recent books on the CCP and Maoist history written by a wonderful writer called Ian Johnson. And this essay was published in the New York Review of Books. And one of the books was about political behavior and attitudes to governance in communist China. And the point that Ian Johnson was making was, what are popular understandings of democracy in China? Are they about having elections, open elections, or are they more about a perception of good governance? And I think that's a really helpful insight into understanding the popularity of the CCP. And just to chip in with my answer to Hans's question, I'm not sure if so much surprised me, but I can definitely talk about something which disturbed me, which was the rhetoric or the tone, for example, coming out of Xi Jinping's big speech on the 1st of July, the tone about China and the international world, so China and the world outside its borders. So there's this very striking paragraph in which Xi Jinping says that China's the people of China are all about justice and fairness, and China has never interfered with any other country. And if any country interferes with China, it will be smashed to pieces. He used, really quite sort of bloody, sort of literal turns of phrase to describe that. And I just worry that that is creating a sense within China that China's interrelations with the world outside its borders, and particularly with the West, have to be troubled and tension-ridden. And heaven knows the Trump regime and sort of governments in the West have plenty to be blamed about in terms of difficult relations with China. But that rhetoric, it's not completely new, but I felt it was quite intense in that speech, and it really troubled me.
Well, I think it should trouble you, and I think that we should think about why does Xi Jinping or other elite actors think that confrontation with the West is a good or useful thing from their own perspective. And again, talk about reversing Deng Xiaoping. Deng Xiaoping is known as Mr. Kaifang, right? Open up. That China can benefit from being open to the world. And what is it that she sees as to China's advantage in creating these conflicts? Nationalism is good from his perspective, but I just am not convinced that he will find this to be a particularly good strategy. We're seeing pushback all around the world, in Europe, in North America, in Japan just the other day. We're seeing a lot of pushback. And I think that this is not a very good diplomatic strategy.
Could I take the opportunity to ask Jeremy a question, in fact? So first of all, I'd just like to say that Joe's book and Jeremy's book are absolutely wonderful and so worth reading, just full of insights about recent and contemporary history. And one thing that Jeremy very laudably tries to do is, and succeeds in doing, is to tell 1989 as social history. And as part of that, Jeremy worked incredibly hard to include as many female and non-Han voices and perspectives in his account of these events. So I wanted to ask Jeremy, if I were to ask you to characterize the different aspects of a female perspective on these events, I wonder what answer would you give? So how do you think female perspectives in the plural on 1989 differ from the more male-dominated perspectives, which perhaps have been stronger in their voices since these events took place?
That's a fantastic question. Yeah, thanks for that question. Well, yeah, I mean, if you look at the literature, the memoirs that came out from participants in 1989, they're mostly written by men. If you look at the top political leadership at the top of the Communist Party, it was all men. And so that was the sort of intellectual political environment that anyone who's studying this topic enters. And so you have to look for perspectives. Of course, women were very involved in the protests. They were university students, they were workers, and they themselves, in their memoirs, Chai Ling's memoir is one, and Anna Wong's memoir is another that I cite both extensively in my book. They actually reflect on this question. What is it like to be a woman in the protest movement, and how can I use my status? This is Chai Ling I'm talking about. How can I use my status as the only woman in the room to try to make a difference here? And so she actually does reflect on this question that she says she's more interested in compromise. She waits until the decision-making process comes to a head to intervene, and she is very reflective about that. And Wang Yan is as well, as sort of an entry-level office worker for a Japanese firm who is not only dealing with hyper-masculine Chinese culture, but hyper-masculine Japanese culture in her office. And she's dealing with romantic relationships with guys who are enmeshed in that culture as well. So I think that this is one of the biggest areas for future research in the 1980s, is just to make a point of being inclusive and pay attention to diverse voices and views.
Joe, do you have any hopes for the CCP becoming less male-dominated, less patriarchal?
No, I don't. It's become more male-dominated. There seems to be one female on the Politburo at each Congress. No female has ever been on the Politburo Standing Committee. I believe that the number of women on the Central Committee is down from about 8% to about 4%. We've been running in reverse for the last 30 years or so. There was a time in the 90s in particular, I remember, where they were downsizing factories. And they did make a little bit of an effort to say, okay, we have a couple working for this company. Which one should we fire? Well, 8 out of 10 times it turned out to be the woman. And there were whole discussions in the Chinese press at the time about what happened to women hold up half the sky. And there were rebuttals of, well, basically, it's 1950s America. Women stay home to raise the kids and all that sort of stuff. And, there are a lot of really talented women in China, as we all know, and they are marginalized over and over again. So I wish I could be more optimistic.
Rachel, I can see a lot of interesting questions in the chat. Do you want us to turn to some of those?
Yes, let's get to chat questions. It was such an interesting discussion. I didn't want to pause too soon. Hans, since you haven't spoken a little bit, the first question that came in was directed to you, so I will pose it. Do you think China offers an alternative to the world as far as polity and state formation is concerned?
I think that is a key question, and it's one that Tim Cheek, who's actually with us tonight, and Klaus Mühlhahn, we discussed this at length. And before we go into that, and say, actually, and it relates to some of the other questions that have been posed as well, that the Chinese Communist Party has made a success of communist revolution, at least economically. It's the first to do that, and thereby it has undermined all kinds of assumptions that people have made about how to grow an economy, how to modernize, how to urbanize, etc., etc. I think beyond, and so in many ways the challenge intellectually, politically, that the rise of China, not just the CCP, poses is actually really fundamental, and I don't think we actually have begun to grapple with the enormity of that. So a containment strategy makes no sense, because behind the containment strategy was the idea that the USSR will fall apart because of its own contradictions. That's unlikely to happen. But I think we can push that a little bit further even, and one person who I take very seriously is Wang Gungwu in Singapore. And that sort of echoes some of the points that have been made so far. For him, in a recent work, and I really agree with him, there's sort of a new confidence in China, which says that they have some of the answers to the world's problems, and they're no longer judge themselves simply by the yardstick of the West. So for the last 150 to 100 years, China's been trying to catch up with the West and believing that it must achieve this, that what the West has is what they need to achieve. I think now the change for Xi Jinping, and it's beyond, Xi Jinping symbolizes that. So say, well, actually, we have some of our own answers, and they are not so bad. And in China, many people do believe that with the financial crises, the Middle Eastern wars, the kinds of problems that we have seen last summer in the United States, or that have been expressed through those, there's lots of problems that the West has too. So there's a different, and that I think beginning to deal with the reality that there is China's rise, and they may have done some things that are actually, we might have to draw lessons from, or that we might at least cause us to reflect on our own basic assumptions. That's going to be very interesting in the future. And I think Xi Jinping pushes it too far, and that's where some of this, what is it, Topo Liuxie kind of wordage comes from. But I think this basic confidence in China having some of its own answers, or at least the resources to formulate nuances, is a big change.
We've had a question. What do you think is the role of the business sector for the CCP, both now and in China's future?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? We've just had the Ma Yun case with the checking of the Alibaba or Ant Group IPO, and just a couple of days ago, DD being under investigation. It suggests that there's a real rethinking going on at the top of the party about precisely that, party business relations. And, one could imagine, I suppose, that this would come out with a fairly healthy regulatory system, or it could promote this sort of personalized relationship between business and government entities, of which there's been quite a bit, but maybe that could be more systematized. I was just wondering whether this is going to be a 21st century, whatever we're in, version of Guandu Shangban, the government supervision and merchant management. It seems like sometimes the history of China is repeating itself. Maybe it didn't work in the 19th century. Can China make that work in the 21st century? I don't know, but I think that that's one of the really, really critical questions going forward. Maybe I'd add to critical questions, technology. China is now, like the United States, in its own way, thinking about various forms of decoupling, or making sure that its supply lines don't run through Washington, D.C., for instance, through the United States. China has a very significant science and technology foundation. Is it enough to become an innovative society, self-sustaining? We've always taken it for granted that only open communications promote, and competition, promote the sort of technological development that the West has enjoyed over the last, 300 years. China is now looking for another model of that, where you can have the innovation, but not the vulnerability. And I don't know if that's possible. We've got to keep watching for another 100 years or so. We'll get back here with our next books.
It does take me about 100 years to write a book, so I can work with that within that time frame.
If I have 2 sabbaticals, I can do it.
Jeremy, we have a question for you. How are you able to research June 4th since the seems to be trying to erase it from history?
Yeah, it's definitely a challenging topic to work on. It's more challenging to work on 1989 than it is to do research on the Great Leap Forward, which was a famine in which tens of millions of people died between 1959 and 1961, or even the Cultural Revolution, 1966 to 76. These are all, when we're reading news about the anniversary, the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party, usually the Western news, the New York Times says, "Oh, what about these things? What about famine, Cultural Revolution, Tiananmen Square?" 1989 is more of a sensitive topic, and it's basically been erased, or it's attempted to have been erased. Louisa Lim's book, The People's Republic of Amnesia, is really good on the party's efforts to censor and erase the memory of 1989. But it's so important that people want to get their stories out in spite of those restrictions. And for people for whom it was a personal turning point, and there were hundreds and hundreds of people whose lives were changed drastically because of their participation in the protests, or because of their just disgust and grief about the massacre, they want to get their stories out, and they want to leak documents and stories out. So in a way, it was possible to do the research mostly outside of China using university libraries in North America and Europe. And it was, at the time that I was doing some of my research during the early stages, possible to talk behind closed doors in China with people who participated, who told me, "Please write this book. Thank you for writing this book. We need this story to get out, but we can't do it. We can't publish it in China right now." So yeah, it was definitely challenging, but that's my job. I mean, that's the job of tenured university professors who have the protection and who have academic freedom to write on topics that are important. So that would be my answer there.
We've had a question posed to the panel that might be more directed towards you, Jeremy, but we'll open it to see if anyone else also wants to respond. How does the new generation of people in the PRC view the 1989 Tiananmen protests? How does the CCP depict the 1989 protests to the people of the PRC? And what kind of questions does the party face from the public regarding the party's role to crush the protests?
Well, questions are not allowed or appreciated within China about what happened. Private meetings to commemorate the protests are cracked down on. Participants are arrested. The parents of protesters who died are monitored and taken away from the capital city every year. They're treated like criminals themselves. So it's definitely suppressed. But people who are curious do find ways to study it. People who don't know much about it, and even friends of mine, some of them argue that it was necessary to preserve stability, to crack down on the protests. Others totally disagree and think that it was a terrible crime and unnecessary at all. So there's a diversity of responses, but it's all taking part in this very repressive context that makes it difficult to talk about openly. And so the party's view has changed over time. Immediately after the crackdown in 1989, it was celebrating the achievement of the army in quelling a counter-revolutionary riot. And then it very quickly, that didn't go over very well. So then it just became political turbulence. Zhao Ziyang was blamed for splitting the party when in fact it was Deng Xiaoping who deposed him. So it's just a few lines in the textbooks now, and coverage of it is quite limited.
If I remember correctly, I don't know, Jeremy, how much this is emphasized now, but certainly in the immediate aftermath, there was a lot of blame put on foreign elements, that there was CIA subversion sort of reaching out to the quote unquote black hands, which of course plays into that Xi Jinping narrative and the narrative that you see on the evening news of everything in China being stable and safe, and the outside world being a sort of scary, threatening place. How important is that narrative still in official representations of 1989?
That's an important narrative. It's still there to blame foreign intrusion and interference in terms of trying to promote protests, trying to take advantage of the protests, trying to radicalize the protests. There isn't evidence to support those claims. I think that's an insult to the intelligence of the millions and millions of people of Beijing who did hit the streets to protests, that to say that they were somehow manipulated by foreign forces. They had their own ideas and they had their own agency, and the foreigners were not entirely sure of what was going on, and certainly not able to keep up with the rapidity of the protests and how events were changing at the time. But yeah, it's a tried and true narrative that I'm sure will also be applied to my book. As a foreigner, I'm just trying to, make China look bad by writing about this dark chapter in its history, which is unfortunate because it's history that needs to be talked about openly, I think.
We have a couple more minutes, and so I wanted to give our panelists a chance to any closing remarks, any kind of final questions for one another before I give our kind of final closing announcement.
Oh, interesting. I guess we were talking about this before in a little bit, and maybe we can explore it a bit more. Sort of what is happening with history in China more generally. Mm-hmm. And sort of history is back, and that the difference in my view is that history the past was condemned as the feudal heritage that we could museumify, forget about, and we move on into a great new future. But history is back in so many ways. I think it's going to have great consequences, including for thinking about what is China. What is its size? How succession works in the past? What are the values of China? So the whole idea of China's identity is, and I think actually all the books we've talked about, all the three books here, in many ways address that, and that's one way I think of bringing them together. But that would be sort of my thought.
Hans, you bring up history as being really reinvigorated. I think that there's an interesting interplay between the New Qing history,
yes,
in the West, and what's going on in China, which really challenges this notion of the dominant 5,000-year history of the Han. The minorities are completely eliminated from that history, and that's going to come back and bite you. And party history is going to do the same thing as well. There are aspects, as Rachel knows, that need to be opened up and explored that I'm trying to work on. Party history was not very pleasant. It really was not. And there are enough Chinese historians who know that this story is going to come out, as well as stories about June 4th and so forth. History is going to be an important topic in trying to forge a narrative about why was the revolution needed?
Yeah,
what's it done?
I would just want to encourage everybody to read the Chinese Communist Party in 10 Lives and Joe's book about rethinking the Chinese Communist Party or Chinese politics. What I really like about them is that they remind us that the Communist Party itself has a history of liberalism, has a history of cosmopolitanism. You see that in Hans's chapter, has a history of inspiring, very unexpected and shocking movements outside of China, as Julia's excellent chapter shows us about the Shining Path in Peru. So it's the sort of dwelling on the unfortunate language today and on the repression today, which is all true. It obscures the fact that those liberal cosmopolitan aspects of the party are still there. They have to be quiet right now, but I don't think they're gone forever. And Joe's book is fantastic, and it just reminds us that if the Communist Party tells us that it's institutionalizing, that doesn't mean that it's institutionalizing. You have to look at what it's actually doing beyond what it's actually saying. And that's what Joe does in his book. So both books, fantastic. I highly recommend them.
Can I make one more point on that? I think we were very delighted to have 2 Chinese contributors work with us, and we said until the last moment. And some of those are actually, they will be criticized. So it's both courageous but also great. But we have all come through a long period in which we have worked very closely with Chinese colleagues, often in China, using their connections, using their archives, without which we could not work. And that's been a great thing, and that is something that I think we really must try to preserve. Without that collaboration, our histories of China are going to be no good either.
One looks forward to the days when their histories of China are so much better than ours.
Exactly.
That's really what we look for. And we're trying to, be foreign court reporters who report on what we can find out about it, stimulate interest. I would be perfectly happy if the party would say, Fewsmith's book's no good. Here are the documents to prove it.
Yes.
You really want to have an honest conversation. And hopefully black spots in party history like June 4th and so many others will be opened up for people in China.
All right, we're at 3 minutes after 3 o'clock and 3 minutes after 8 o'clock. So we'll wrap things up. I want to thank everyone who submitted questions. I think we got to most of them. So I'm sorry if we did not get to your question, but it was really just so fascinating to have the panelists in discussion with each other, both at the beginning of the Q&A, throughout the Q&A, and at the end of this Q&A. And thank you again to each of our panelists. Thank you, Hans, Joseph, Jeremy, Julia. It's been such a fascinating and thought-provoking discussion, and I just feel honored to have been a part of it.